A small Picardy farm, known as Mucky Farm or Moo-Cow Farm to the troops, stood in the path of the British and Commonwealth advance on the Somme in the summer of 1916. Its lush pastures, once rich farmland, became a killing ground where thousands died. As we continue our look at the events 105 years ago during the Battle of the Somme in 1916, this week we're going to take a walk to Mouquet Farm, Ferme de Mouquet, Mucky Farm or Moo-Cow Farm to the soldiers who fought there in 1916. But we'll begin our walk in the village of Ovillers, Ovillers to the soldiers. This village sat behind the German front line at the beginning of the Battle of the Somme. This was part of their defensive line on a front established in late 1914 after the French and the German armies had met on the Somme in the autumn of that year. Both sides dug in, and this ground here around the village of Ovillers was part of the German defences. The village sat part way down a valley and was astride a main road, an old Roman road, the Albert-Bapaume road, and which on the other side was another valley. When the British came here in 1915, they named all of these features, and one valley, at the end of which was a sausage-shaped German observation balloon that kept popping up to have a look at the Allied lines, that became known as Sausage Valley, and in front of the village of Ovillers, the valley there naturally became Mash Valley, because you can't have sausage without mash. The village sat on some commanding ground, and where the German front line was, it was in a bit of a U-shape at this particular position. It went off to the north up towards the high ground at Thiepval. It looked straight down Mash Valley as the British lines came across at a bit of an angle, and then where the Albert-Bapaume road was to the south, it went along the contours of the high ground there, creating, for the Germans, an ideal killing ground. And despite the tremendous Somme bombardment at the beginning of the Battle of the Somme, the attack here on the 1st of July 1916 ended in disaster, with thousands of casualties for the units that tried to advance across this ground that day. There was no success here, but the bedraggled survivors of the units that tried to assault Ovillers were relieved by fresh troops, and the battle continued. Unit after unit fought through here, and gradually the Germans were pushed back. On the 7th of July, units from the 12th Eastern Division, which included men from the Royal Fusiliers, the Suffolk Regiment, the Norfolk Regiment and the Royal Sussex Regiment, pushed hard against the German defences on the western side of the village, and the German line there was taken. For the next week or so, Ovillers sat in a strange salient, a strange curvature in the line, where part of the old German line came down from the north. The British were occupying most of the village, but the Germans were still holding the grounds to the east towards the village of Pozières. Part of the position along the Albert-Bapaume road was still in German hands, and the Ferme de Mouquet, Mucky Farm, which before the Battle of the Somme had been a headquarters and medical post for the units that had held the line around the village of Ovillers, now sat on its commanding ground and offered a substantial obstacle in the next phase of the advance. We're starting the walk just outside Ovillers Church. It's only a small village, not much really bigger than Courcelette, where I lived for many years on the Somme. They're very similar sorts of villages. In fact, all of the villages in this area have populations that only number in the couple of hundred. Before the war, they'd been much bigger, but with the destruction, the total destruction of places like this, a very high percentage of people just never returned, unsure of whether their houses and their farms would be rebuilt, and the primitive conditions that many had to live in. This put off, really, many people who might have wished to return, and they ended up moving to other parts of France or up into Belgium. Fighting returned to Ovillers both in March and then in August of 1918 as the Germans first swept through this area during the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle, the German spring offensive, en route to Albert, which was captured on the 27th of March 1918. Ovillers probably falling the day before. The line here was collapsing at that point, and there were pockets of resistance, and the Germans weren't properly held again until the town of Albert was secured on the western side along the old railway line. But Ovillers in August 1918 saw a return to battle again when British troops fought through here. Men from the Welsh Division came up over the Ancre Valley, swam the Ancre River, and then continued with their advance to the villages beyond here, Contalmaison, across towards Longueval, and eventually reaching the Morval Ridge. So by the end of the Great War, having been fought over on numerous occasions, and during the Battle of the Somme, been absolutely saturated with shell fire, like most Somme villages, this was part of the Zone Rouge, the Red Zone, and had seen total and utter destruction. There was absolutely nothing left of Ovillers. So when we walk through the village as we are now to go to the eastern side of it, towards the village of Pozières, every single building we see here dates from the 1920s or later. Some of the 1920s brick buildings now are beginning to show their age and probably look as if they've been here for much longer, but there was nothing left of this village. It was just a pile of brick dust. And this was so typical, really, of the experience of villages like this right across the Somme and right across many battlefields in both northern and eastern France. As we emerge from the village and come out into the open fields, we can see the village of Pozières just ahead of us to the right. At this particular point, because of the lie of the land, the rising ground to our left, we can't see the Ferme de Mouquet, Mucky Farm. That's out of view from where we are. And as we come out of the village, the road bends round to the right to meet the Albert-Bapaume road, but there's a minor road going off just ahead of us, and that's the direction that we will follow. But we're just going to stop at this particular point because it connects us to a great memoir of the First World War. And that memoir was by author Charles Carrington, A Subaltern's War. It was published in 1929, and he originally wrote it under the name Charles Edmonds. I met Charles Carrington at my very first Western Front Association meeting in the 1980s. He gave a talk about his war experiences. And I remember he stood up, a man in his 90s, and spoke for nearly 2 hours describing the events that he'd taken part in during the Battle of the Somme in 1916, and then later in the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917 with a bit on the Hindenburg line in between around Peronne. It was incredible for me at my first meeting to see a veteran stand up and talk like this. And I remember one of the things that he said, and I'll always remember this particular phrase, he said, "No quartermaster ever stole my rum." And what he meant by that was that many of the memoirs that were published about the time that he published The Subaltern's War were very critical of the war, were anti-war, and somehow decried the experience of many of those who were in it as a terrible, awful time. And he made it quite clear that he'd enjoyed his war, he'd got a lot from it, and he was positive about aspects of it. He'd lost many friends and many comrades. He'd been responsible for having to write many letters to the families of soldiers under his command who had died, and he'd been decorated himself for bravery in the Third Battle of Ypres in 1917 with the Military Cross. But for him, the war was not something that he regretted or wanted to forget, but something that he wanted to explain and put into its wider context. And I think that that was, for me, an interesting angle into this, because then I'd read the poetry of Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon. I'd watched Oh What a Lovely War. I'd seen it performed on a stage. I saw that side of the war portrayed, so it was interesting to hear Carrington's, and I would very much recommend a read of his memoirs, A Subaltern's War, and I'll put a link on the Old Frontline website to that, oldfrontline.co.uk. Charles Carrington, the man, was born in West Bromwich in 1897. He originally enlisted as an ordinary soldier in the Royal Warwickshire Regiment in 1914 and was commissioned in the 9th Battalion, the York and Lancaster Regiment, but he later transferred to the 1st 5th Territorial Battalion of the Royal Warwickshire Regiment in the 48th South Midland Division. And like I say, he fought with them here on the Somme, right on the spot where we're standing now, later on the Hindenburg line, and during the Third Battle of Ypres, where he was decorated for bravery. I walked this bit of ground with my dad the first time I came to the Somme in 1982. I'd read Charles Carrington's book. I'd picked up a paperback copy of it after going to that talk that he'd given, and I saw there was a very good map in it detailing where he'd fought, and I saw that it wasn't that far from Albert. Myself and my dad had come by train to Albert. We had no transport, so we were going to walk everywhere. And one day we walked out here to Ovillers, and I came up to this spot here to sit and read Carrington's book and reflect that I was now standing on a spot where a man that I'd met and spoken to had fought. And I think this is one of the things really that gave me the impetus at that time to continue to track these veterans down and connect their war, connect their stories to places here along the old front line. This was Carrington's first action on the Somme. They'd been in reserve on the first day of the Battle of the Somme and seen some of their sister battalions take a bit of a pasting up around Serre in the attack on the Heidenkopf. In this attack, they came up on the other side of the Albert-Bapaume road in the valleys that gave them cover for the approach, and they came up over the road from across to our right. So as the main road goes up towards the Albert-Bapaume road, that's the direction they came from, towards where we are now, towards these big modern agricultural hangars that we can see directly in front of us. And the assault here that they took part in that day went very well. The Germans were across to their right in Pozières, ahead of us on the high ground, to the left of the track where we're standing now, but they got forward. In fact, so far forward, they took trenches ahead of their objective. And Carrington notes in his book how they set up their defensive positions, their bomb blocks and their Lewis guns. And initially they were told to pull back from this position because they'd gone too far, but then the commanding officer came up, assessed the situation and realised this was a better position to hold, and they held it, so the line was pushed forward a little bit further than anticipated. This was only a minor action. They'd advanced, then they held this ground. They suffered casualties in the process. Carrington describes the death and the wounding of several men within his platoon and company. But this was typical of some of the fights on the Somme at this stage. It wasn't like the first day with big over-the-top attacks. These were small-scale operations, essentially a type of bite and hold where units went forward, captured a bit of ground, held that ground, consolidated that ground, and slowly but surely the offensive continued. And they were then relieved by British troops, who were then relieved by Australian troops, and the fighting in this area continued. But for a more in-depth description of this particular part of the battlefield and what that fight was like here in July of 1916, like I say, do have a read of A Subaltern's War. So we'll continue along the minor roads, keeping the Albert-Bapaume road to our right. We'll go past those modern agricultural hangars, and the minor road that we're on remains tarmacked until a point where the tarmac suddenly runs out and it's just a grass track. Now at that particular point we'll stop because we've got a good view across towards Pozières to our right. Now, following the actions in this area from units like Charles Carrington's 1st 5th Royal Warwicks, as I say, other units then came in from the same division. 1st 5th Royal Sussex was here. I interviewed another veteran who took part in the operations here in July 1916 with the 5th Sussex Pioneer Battalion as they were then. But then around the 21st, 22nd of July, those units began to pull out, and the Australians, men from the 1st Australian Division, began to move into this area. They'd marched down from northern France, where having come from Gallipoli to Egypt, via Marseille to France, and then taken over a section of the Western Front in the northern part of the line, in that forgotten front, to acclimatise to conditions here on the Western Front, they'd marched down to take part in the Battle of the Somme. Now, the 1st Australian Division were the original Anzacs, the men who had stepped forward in 1914 in that response to Australia's call to arms. These were battalions that had taken part in the original Gallipoli landings on the 25th of April 1915, a date that would eventually, of course, become known as Anzac Day, when men from the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, serving together at that time, landed on the Gallipoli shore and moved inland as part of the operations in the Dardanelles. Having fought right through the Gallipoli operations, many of the original members of these 1st Australian Division battalions had been killed or wounded during those operations. New men had arrived to replace them, and when they got to Egypt at the end of the Gallipoli campaign, further reinforcements came across from Australia to replace them. And although Gallipoli was really a microcosm of the war on the Western Front, what was apparent to Australian commanders when they got here to France and took over that line in northern France, that this was a very different sort of war. It was on a much bigger scale, and they were fighting a much more formidable enemy in many respects. Not necessarily better or braver than the Turks, but just the logistics and the infrastructure behind the Imperial German Army was massive on a scale with what they'd encountered with the Ottoman Turkish army in Gallipoli in 1915. So they were experienced troops, and what they proved here in the attack on Pozieres, and if we look to our right, we can see the valley leading up towards the village of Pozieres itself. We can see the large Pozieres British Cemetery and Memorial just astride the main Albert Bapaume Road over to our right, and we can see the obelisk of the 1st Australian Division Memorial close to the site of the former Gibraltar bunker, which was a German concrete observation bunker that was there that looked like the Rock of Gibraltar, thus its name. That's roughly the route that the Australians went into the village. They came across slightly from the right on the other side of the Albert Bapaume Road, near to the site of a quarry that's still there, which you may just be able to see from this position, up into the village, and took the village of Pozieres in a single operation on the night of the 23rd, 24th of July 1916. In many respects for the Australians, the capture of Pozieres village was the easy bit. Holding it was much more difficult. The Germans launched massive counterattacks against the Australian positions with a huge amount of artillery fire. But there were two obstacles in their next line of advance. One of those was on the far side of Pozieres village, on the very highest point of the Somme battlefields, near to the Pozieres windmill, a big stone tower, a windmill that existed and operated there before the war. It was now in a ruinous state. But either side of that was two distinct lines of trenches known as the OG lines, the old German lines. And this was a formidable line of defence that would take the Australians much of the next few weeks to try and clear, with attack after attack going in there. That was roughly on their right flank, with the village of Pozieres in the middle. Over to their left was the farm complex of the Ferme de Mouquet, Mucky Farm, and that also presented a formidable obstacle. So the next phase of Australia's story on the Somme, which would bring in Australian division after Australian division, thousands of men into these battlefields over the course of July, August and into September of 1916, much of the focus was on beyond Pozieres at the OG lines, but also Mouquet Farm that we're heading towards now. And we'll continue along this track, following it, noting the rise of the ground to our left. Eventually we'll begin to see the rooftops of Mouquet Farm in the distance, and where it meets the Pozieres to Thiepval Road, that'll be our next stop. Having reached the main road, we'll just cross over onto another track that's directly opposite, just to get off the road itself, because this can be quite a busy road from Pozieres to Thiepval. And standing here, if we look towards Pozieres, we can see the village, we can see the obelisk of the 1st Australian Division Memorial that commemorates the men from that division who took the village and pushed on beyond this ground towards where we are now and across towards the OG lines. We can see the radio mast of the Pozieres windmill site, and in front of that is the memorial to the 2nd Australian Division who fought in the attacks in that ground in August, particularly in August of 1916. And then turning round to look in the direction of Thiepval, we can see the top of the Thiepval Memorial in the distance just ahead of us, the big Lutyens archway of mighty Thiepval. And to our right, beyond the fields where we're standing now, again we can see the rooftops of Ferme de Mouquet, Mucky Farm, in the distance there. So we've got to roughly a point that was reached in late July, early August of 1916, with the Australians capturing Pozieres village. British troops continued in the ground north of Ovillers, and they got to a position here called Skyline Trench, which was just across to our left, and this guarded the approaches really to Mouquet Farm. So this put the Australians in a position where they could begin their attacks across this ground. And again, it was not so much full-scale assaults, it was moving forward, taking trench after trench, and then the nearer they got to the farm, it became small battles to capture particular bits of trench and advance across the ground around it. And that's really what turned Mouquet Farm into this mincing machine, this grinding down battle where unit after unit was thrown in, unit after unit got some small foothold, was often pushed back by the Germans, and by the time they were relieved had suffered tremendous casualties. For what? This was the thing that you read in some of the accounts of the Australian units that fought here. It's very difficult to see any degree of success given all the casualties that they'd suffered. So if we then come off the track and continue along the road, eventually we get to a little clump of trees on the right-hand side where there's a memorial, and we're looking straight towards Mouquet Farm itself. And this memorial came about in the 1990s. There was no official memorial to the Australian involvement in the fighting at Mouquet Farm at that particular point. And in the 90s, there was a big move by the Australian government to properly commemorate sites where men from the Australian formations had fought. Not just here on the Somme, but in places like Fromelles as well. And it led to a plan eventually for the opening of an Australian visitor centre, which became the John Monash Centre, which you can visit on the Somme today near Villers-Bretonneux. Some people see this as the Australianisation of the Western Front, and Zachary as people often refer to it. But at that time, Australia was moving forward remembrance and understanding in Australia of its role, not just in Gallipoli, but here on the Western Front. Something like 8,500 Australians were killed or died of wounds received at Gallipoli. On the Western Front, it was something like 45,000. So this was their main theatre of war. And there was a move by Australian historians, and I say by the government itself, to properly commemorate that and memorialise that with sites like this. Now, the Mouquet Farm and the ground that we're standing on was owned by the Gauntz family. We're going to talk more about them later on in the walk. At the time, in the 1990s, at the time, Monsieur Gauntz was still the mayor of Courcelette, where I lived. And he gave this ground to the Australians so they could build this memorial to the events here at Mouquet Farm, for which he was eventually decorated with the Order of Australia for all the things that he'd done to help Australian remembrance on the Somme battlefields for many, many years. Every year he welcomed Australian groups into the village of Courcelette to not just make them welcome, but to give them an insight into just how important the remembrance of Australian sacrifice was to the modern generation in France. And that's something that continues to this day. So what is it we can see from this memorial, and what's the history of the ground in front of us? Well, standing here on the edge of the road, on this little bit of promontory ground, we can see across what is like a bit of a valley towards the farm itself. We can see the modern farm buildings on the right-hand side in a bit of a dilapidated state, and on the left-hand side a big area of pasture with a fence round it and some trees, and that's the site of the original Mouquet Farm. To our right, we can see a quarry, and in the ground around the quarry, that is land that has never been ploughed since the First World War. And when you come here in the winter months and you can catch the right light on a frosty ground, you can see the shell craters that are so typical of the shell smashed ground that this whole area once was. The positions in and around the farm favoured a German defence because there's rising ground beyond it where they can have another defensive line, which they did do. There's the village of Courcelette over to the right that acted as a route in for reserves to the area via different defensive positions and trenches there. The high ground of Thiepval is across to the left. So this was a bit of ground that any attacker moving into this potentially could be enfiladed, could be fired at from multiple directions. And this is essentially part of the problem that the Australians experienced here in their fighting from the 8th of August 1916 through to the 3rd of September. During that period, there were 9 separate attacks by 3 different Australian divisions. Units from the 1st Australian Division who captured the village, units from the 2nd Australian Division, and also the 4th Australian Division, which had recently arrived on the Western Front. During that time, the Australians suffered over 11,000 casualties in the fighting for Mouquet Farm, killed, wounded and missing. And amongst the killed was a very, very high percentage of missing soldiers. The majority of the men from Australian battalions killed in the fighting for Mucky Farm, for Moo-Cow Farm, as they often called it, do not have a known grave and are commemorated on the Villers-Bretonneux Memorial to the Missing, which commemorates the Australian soldiers who died in France from 1916 until the end of the war and have no known grave. As I said earlier, the fighting here was not big attacks really. There were assaults by individual battalions, but it was more a case, the nearer they got to the farm, it was bit by bit by bit, trench by trench, traverse by traverse, getting into the ruins of the farm, at some point getting through those ruins to the far side, and unbeknown to the Australians in the first phase of the battle, there was a lot of tunnel complexes beneath the farm itself and deep cellars. The Germans utilised those, so when the Australians passed over, they popped up from underground and fired into the rear of the Australian positions. So this proved to be really a bit of a charnel house for the Australian battalions coming through here at that time. And with the close proximity of both sides with only yards between frontline positions. There was not a dedicated Australian front line and a dedicated German line. Often they shared the same bit of trench with just a bomb block, a barricade in the middle of it where they were lobbing grenades over at each other. There was shell fire, there was trench mortar fire, rifle grenades and hand grenades were used, and the whole ground around the farm was just smashed to bits by this fighting. After all those weeks of this bit by bit, trench by trench fighting that the Australians had taken part in here, they handed over in early September to Canadian troops who had just moved down. The Canadian Corps formed up in Flanders from the Canadian divisions that were then on the Western Front under the command of a British general, Julian Byng, had moved down from Flanders to take part in the Battle of the Somme, and they'd taken over positions around the OG lines near to the Pozières windmill, to the south of Pozières village towards Bazentin, and then here in the north around the Ferme de Mouquet, around Mucky Farm. The Canadians were building up for a major attack, which eventually would become the Battle of Flers-Courcelette on the 15th of September 1916, when the Canadian Corps attacked Courcelette village, the sugar refinery on the Albert-Bapaume road, and also assaulted this ground here at Mucky Farm. But before that, battalions moved in and engaged in the same sort of fighting, the same kind of minor operations that the Australians had done in the preceding weeks. A good example of that is the experience of the 16th Battalion Canadian Infantry, the Canadian Scottish, commanded here by Major Cy Peck. Peck had distinguished himself in the Second Battle of Ypres in April and May of 1915. He was Canadian-born, and he would go on in 1918 in the battles of the Drocourt-Quéant switch line in September of that year to be awarded a Victoria Cross for his bravery. The Canadian-Scottish regimental history is a particularly good one, and this is a description in that history describing the ground around Mouquet Farm when the battalion took over here in early September of 1916. Bodies were lying everywhere, some partly buried, others above ground, in various states of mutilation. One body, close to me, was absolutely naked, covered with wounds. Above ground, the dark night, the rain, and the intense enemy shelling combined to demoralise. Below ground, in the shelter, where the Australian Battalion's headquarters and regimental aid posts were both stationed, the atmosphere, in another way, was equally depressing. The dugout, if it could be called by that name, for it was but two large holes, was a dozen or so steps leading down to them, was ill ventilated, crowded with men sitting on the stairs and lying about on the floor. On entering the place, the first whiff of the atmosphere, heavy with the vapour rising from the damp clothes of the runners and linesmen who were resting between spells of duty, and the odours from the dressing station, which was separated from headquarters only by a blanket, made any newcomer shiver. The air was so bad that the candles burned, but with a faint glimmer. The Australians, lithe, wiry soldiers, full of grit, were utterly exhausted. Information from the front line was almost unobtainable, and what little there was not particularly helpful. So that was the positions that they took over from the Australians described in the regimental history, and the battle that they fought here was a battle of bombing blocks and small trenches, where positions just separated by one of these blocks, a load of rubbish, some collapsed positions, a few sandbags, that was all that separated them from the Germans. So once again, this was not big attacks, bayonets fixed, over the top, following a barrage. This was almost like the day-to-day activities of trench warfare, but on a bigger scale and with much heavier casualties. The 16th Battalion Canadian Infantry, the Canadian Scottish, next to the Second Battle of Ypres, suffered more casualties here just holding the ground around Mouquet Farm than in any other of their engagements of the entire war, and come the end of it, they had perilously little to show for it. A veteran of the Canadian Scottish who fought here later wrote, "Taking it all in all, Mouquet Farm was the most nerve-wracking, hellish time I ever put in. A lifetime in 3 days. Even now, after the lapse of these many years, I shudder at the thought of my experiences there." Some days later, the Canadian Scottish were pulled out, and the other units of the 1st Canadian Division, who were then under the command of General Arthur Currie, who would go on to be the Corps Commander in 1917 for the fighting at Passchendaele and in the final battles on the Western Front in 1918. His units were pulled out and other fresh Canadian battalions came in, and on the 15th of September 1916 the attack on the farm was the extreme left flank of the Canadian Corps assaults on Courcelette, and here the 1st Canadian Mounted Rifles made their attack. The CMRs, the Canadian Mounted Rifles, had been a mounted regiment as such, but never brought their horses to the Western Front. They were essentially an infantry battalion. In fact, there were 4 CMR battalions within the Canadian Corps. Their initial assault on the farm that day failed. There was a few small gains around the rubble and close to the quarry. The farm was taken at one point the next day on the 16th of September, and then the Germans counter-attacked and threw the Canadians back. And it remained in this impasse situation, this stalemate, and the Canadians continued with their fight around the village of Courcelette itself and upwards towards Kenora Trench, Zollengraben, and eventually Regina Trench. Towards the end of September, the Canadians here were relieved and units from the 11th Northern Division moved in. They were one of the very first Kitchener's Army New Army divisions to be formed in 1914. They'd fought at Gallipoli in 1915. Some of the units within the division were some of the very first men of the New Army, Kitchener's Army, to go into action in the Great War. Most people think that was on the Western Front at Loos. It was actually the month before, in August 1915, at Suvla Bay, with men from the 11th Northern Division. They had then come from Gallipoli to Egypt and eventually to France, and then occupied the trenches up in northern France before taking part in the Battle of the Somme. And on the 26th of September 1916, they were involved in the attack on Mouquet Farm. Their pioneer battalion, the 6th Battalion, the East Yorkshire Regiment, plays a key role in this. They are digging the communication trenches across no man's land, across the contested ground, to enable fresh troops to move up and exploit positions when they were captured. So rather than rely on the existing positions, dig new trenches to move men forward, to bit by bit move your way across this deadly landscape. And the infantry attacks are slightly pushed back by the German defenders, and one of the officers of one of the platoons of the 6th East Yorks, Lieutenant Tom Coultas, sees that this is a critical situation. So he tells his lads to put down their shovels, pick up their rifles, and that was one of the points of pioneer battalions, that they were both engineers, pioneers that could do work like this, but they were also infantry soldiers who could fight. So he said, put down your spades, put down your shovels, lads, put down your picks, pick up your Lee Enfields, we're going into action. And he led an assault on the German positions here, and in doing so was sadly killed as he took them in. They then used some of the gear that they had with them, smoke for example, to smoke out some of the German defenders, to throw explosive charges down into the dugouts. At this stage in the Battle of the Somme, what were called P-bombs were used in great profusion. These were phosphorus hand grenades that were thrown down into dugouts and trenches and positions that would kill everyone inside and neutralise the defenders of any given position. The Canadians had used them extensively in the attack on Courcelette. Quite a grim weapon, which you don't see much description of, and I think because it was perhaps considered by the British a bit of an ungentlemanly type weapon, but it was used. And that key assault by Coultas and his men at that critical moment in the attack helped tip the balance in this final attack, this final capture of Mouquet Farm. They had cleared the dugouts, they had cleared the cellars and captured one officer and 33 men. And other units from the division moved forward, and finally, after all these weeks, after all these thousands of Australian and then Canadian and finally British casualties, Mouquet Farm was captured. But it was just blasted off the landscape. There was absolutely nothing left here. And if you look at aerial photographs from this period, it is the typical moonscape of shell holes that we associate with the Great War. There's no visible trace of the farm or even some of the tracks. It's just shell hole after shell hole after shell hole. Tom Coultas, who was killed in that final assault on the farm, was a Grantham lad from Lincolnshire. He was the son of an agricultural engineer, and he'd been educated at Howelbury and at Cambridge. He had a bright engineering future ahead of him, but was killed and another life cut short by the Battle of the Somme. He was buried at Avului Communal Cemetery, away from the battlefront, and you'll find his grave there. Most of the men who died beside him in the attack on the German trenches and clearing the dugouts and the cellars are buried in a plot in Pozieres British Cemetery, but were originally buried here on the battlefield, and their graves moved there after the war. So while this memorial that we're standing by overlooking the farm commemorates specifically the Australian role in the fighting here, like many corners of the Somme battlefield, this was an international tale. Men from Australia, men from Canada, and men from Britain, all of whom had wide experience in different theatres of war, from Gallipoli to the Western Front, took part in the fight here, thousands of them killed and wounded until what was left of Mouquet Farm was finally captured. We're now going to continue with our journey down to the farm itself. We'll continue along the road towards Thiepval, take the minor road off to the right that leads to the farm, and that will be our next stop. As we walk down this lane towards the farm, we can see both the old and the new Mouquet Farm. On our right is the rebuilt farm, rebuilt in the 1920s, and on the left the pasture where the original farm was located. Now, if you come to visit Mouquet Farm, don't drive down this road. It is a private road, and the farmers here, the Van den Drisch family, who we'll talk about shortly, don't want people driving down here unannounced because it is a working farm, and we have to understand that. It is a memorial site to us, an important historic location, but also a place of business for these people to farm and go about their lives, and that's quite understandable. Walk down here by all means, but obviously don't go into the working farm and don't go into the pasture which is fenced off without permission. And that's the key to things, really. If you come here, look for the farmer, wave, introduce yourself, be polite, explain that you're only coming here to take a few photographs and to see this site, and then go on your way. It's not like coming to the Newfoundland Park or the Thiepval area. This is private land and a working farm. As I've said, we have to respect that. So what do we see when we come here? Well, the rebuilt farm on the right-hand side has been farmed by the same family, the Van den Drisch family. Originally they were from Flanders, from Belgium, moved down to this area in the 19th century, and they were given a 99-year lease of the farm just before the turn of the century by Monsieur Gons, the mayor of Courcelette, who owned the farm and owned the land around it. So the Van den Drischers were the farmers here in 1914. Gons was the owner. When the war came, the Van den Drischers fled. Gons fled as well from Courcelette, and he went back to his house, the Villa Rosa in Le Tréport on the French coast. He was contacted by the War Office in 1916, Monsieur Gons, and his name appears on some of the maps. They produced a special 1 to 5,000 sheet of Mouquet Farm, which includes information about the farm, the cellars, the wells and everything else that was provided to them by Monsieur Gons. It must be one of the few occasions in the war in which an intelligence map, a trench map, actually includes the name of a person who gave up information to make that map more accurate, in this case a Frenchman, a local mayor of the village. And when the war was over and those families came back, Gons back to Courcelette, finding his village in ruins, the Van den Drischers coming back here, they lived in very, very primitive conditions. One of the sons of the Van den Drisch family I knew in Courcelette, and he described how when they came back here, his father spent most of the first few weeks trying to figure out where his farm had been. The ground was so badly smashed by all those years of fighting in the Great War. And they lived in an old army Nissen hut, and the farm wasn't rebuilt until about 1922-23. So they lived in those very primitive conditions here for several years until the farm buildings re-emerged from the landscape. Today the farm is still owned by the Gons family. When I lived in Courcelette, Monsieur Gons, who was the grandson of the mayor in 1916, who was himself the mayor, the Gons family remained mayors of Courcelette for many, many generations. He still owned the farm, and at one stage they were looking at potentially donating it to Australia to become a visitor centre or some type of museum, but that didn't happen. Sadly, Monsieur Gons died in 1999, and the ownership passed to his children. The Van den Drisch family, a different strand of that family, is the ones that farm it today, but there is that continuation with the two families still being involved with this site, and that's quite a nice thing. And while it might give the impression of being a bit of a rundown farm, I mean, a lot of farms in France do look like this. They have sheep here, they grow vegetables in the fields around it, so it is a working, viable, active farm. And I guess this is what the Great War was fought for, so that families could return to their land and renew their lives and begin once more. And over a century later, and those families are still here doing that very thing. So what was the original farm like? So if we're coming up to it, the modern farm is on the right. It's all brick built, the main farm buildings, with a farmhouse at the back and some stable areas and a hangar on the right hand side. But to the left, where the original farm was, that was a typical cour de ferme. So a four-walled farm complex with an arched gateway that you went into. It was almost like a bastion of defence. These farms were built like this so they could be defended. Some of them had ready-made loopholes in the side of them, and you see that in some of the older buildings when you go back behind the lines in places like the Somme. Underneath it was a big cellar complex, and when the Germans took over this in 1914 and turned it into a headquarters and a medical post there, line of evacuation of casualties from the front line at Ovillers and near to Thiepval was through here, and then beyond here into Grandcourt, and from Grandcourt to Miramont, where the main casualty clearing station, their equivalent of a casualty clearing station, was located. The deep cellars, which it was said could hold several hundred men, were greatly expanded upon. The Germans put in concrete positions here at different points as well, some of which you can still see in the pasture land there, and it became quite this formidable bastion. It was designed for defence, it sat in a dominant position, and when you stand here and look back over the ground from the direction where the Australians, the Canadians and eventually the British came, you can see what a dominant position it is. By the main entrance of the farm today is a big pile of battlefield detritus, the relics of war picked up in the fields, and the pile of shells awaiting the Somme bomb squad to come round and pick up the shells and take them away for eventual disposal. This is part of the eternal legacy of these Great War battlefields for farmers like the Van den Drischers, who have to deal with this type of detritus, dangerous stuff, ordnance with explosive, gas, phosphorus, whatever inside, on a regular basis. And the farm and the complex around it and the fields that surround the farm still give up their secrets. Bodies of unknown British and Australian soldiers have been found here in recent times, and the fragments of bodies as well. I think it's testimony to the way this ground was shattered by shell fire that very rarely is a complete body of a soldier found. It's normally fragmentary remains of soldiers, and that's typical on many shell-saturated parts of battlefields like this. And what we'll do as we end this walk, it's not possible as visitors today without the permission of the farmers, but we'll go through the gate into the pasture where the original Moo-Cow, Mucky Farm once stood. As we walk this field and the undulations of the old shell holes, the past seems to fall away amongst the grass here, and we find the echoes of the Somme, the echoes of 1916. Concrete gives sharp edges to the past somehow here. The trees that surround the pasture filter out the rays of ancient sunlight as sheep graze nonchalantly around us. We stand here amongst the ghosts of thousands of men caught up in that bitter struggle for a small Picardy farm, a corner of a foreign field, once one family's home, but for them, the men who fought here, forever their corner of the old front line. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. You can follow me on Twitter at Sommecorps. You can follow the podcast at Old Frontline Pod. Check out the website at oldfrontline.co.uk, where you'll find lots of podcast extras and photographs and links to books that are mentioned in the podcast. And if you feel like supporting us, you can go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/oldfrontline, or support us on Buy Me a Coffee at buymeacoffee.com/oldfrontline. Links to all of these are on our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again soon.